March 1945. A single phone call from the Western Front made Adolf Hitler go silent for 8 seconds. 8 seconds. His generals watched. No one moved. The Führer's hand trembled, gripping the receiver. White knuckles, shallow breath. The message was simple but catastrophic. General George Patton's Third Army had shattered an entire German army group in less than 24 hours. 50,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were now American prisoners. 50,000 in one day. What Hitler said next would reveal just how deeply one man had broken the backbone of Nazi Germany. This is the story of the day the Third Reich realized it was facing a force of nature it could never stop. By March 1945, Nazi Germany was hemorrhaging on 2 fronts. The Soviet Red Army ground forward in the east with overwhelming numbers. Methodical, brutal, expected. But the Western Front had become something else entirely. George S. Patton, Jr. had transformed it into a war of speed, aggression, and psychological domination. His Third Army didn't just advance, it exploded across the German countryside like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. The German generals had fought methodical enemies before. They understood Eisenhower's careful planning. They knew Montgomery's deliberate advances, predictable, manageable, but Patton operated on different principles entirely. Between January and March 1945, his forces were capturing German soldiers at a rate that defied military logic. Thousands of prisoners, every single day. Processing centers overwhelmed. Guards outnumbered by the men they were guarding. Nothing had prepared Hitler's high command for this, and in that bunker, deep beneath Berlin, the Führer held the phone. Silent, trembling. 8 seconds that felt like 8 hours. The unstoppable force he had built was being shattered by one man. The situation facing Wehrmacht commanders in the West had become nightmarish. Their defensive lines, once considered impregnable, were being bypassed or shattered within hours. Not days, hours. Positions that should have held for weeks were overrun before reinforcements could even be dispatched. Patton had perfected what he called reconnaissance in force. His armored columns would probe German defenses, find weak points, and punch through before the enemy could react. By the time a German commander realized where the attack was coming from, Patton's tanks were already 20 miles behind him. His tank commanders had standing orders. 3 rules. Non-negotiable. Never stop. Never wait for infantry. Never give the Germans time to establish new defensive positions. What made this period particularly devastating for Germany was the systematic destruction of entire defensive sectors. When Patton's forces broke through a line, they didn't just push forward. They wheeled around behind German positions, encircling entire divisions. Communication lines were severed, supply routes cut, and before German commanders could coordinate a response, they found themselves surrounded by American armor. Cut off, blind, starving for ammunition. The psychological impact was equally destructive. German soldiers on the Western Front began to develop what their officers called Patton panic. The name spread through the ranks like a disease. Units that might have held their positions against other Allied commanders would abandon them at the mere rumor that the Third Army was approaching. Just the rumor. That was enough. The speed of Patton's advance created a cascading collapse. Retreat bred more retreat. Surrender became preferable to fighting a battle that seemed already lost. One unit broke, then another, then another. The dominoes falling faster than anyone could count. Deep beneath Berlin, in the increasingly isolated world of the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler received daily reports that painted an increasingly desperate picture. Maps covered with arrows, red arrows pushing deeper into Germany every day. Divisions marked as combat effective disappearing overnight. Numbers that didn't make sense, couldn't make sense. But nothing had prepared him for the scale of what was happening along the Rhine and beyond. The reports coming from the Western Front were almost incomprehensible in their magnitude. and they were about to get worse. To understand why German forces collapsed so catastrophically before Patton, you have to understand how fundamentally different his approach to warfare was from anything the Wehrmacht had encountered. George Patton didn't believe in fair fights. He believed in overwhelming violence applied at maximum speed to destroy the enemy's will to resist. Not their bodies, their will. Patton had studied military history obsessively, ancient Rome, Napoleon, the Prussians, every great campaign dissected and analyzed, and he had drawn specific conclusions. The key to victory wasn't killing every enemy soldier. It was breaking the enemy's ability to coordinate, communicate, and maintain cohesion. An army that couldn't operate as a unified force was just a collection of frightened men waiting to surrender. His Third Army operated on principles that seemed almost reckless to conventional military thinkers. When other commanders would pause to consolidate gains and protect supply lines, Patton would order his forces forward. Risks that made his superiors nervous, advances that looked like suicide on paper. But he understood something crucial. The psychological advantage of momentum was worth more than perfect logistics. A defending enemy facing relentless pressure makes mistakes, loses cohesion, and eventually breaks. The Germans called it War of Movement, Bewegungskrieg. They had invented it, perfected it, conquered Europe with it. But Patton took it to extremes they couldn't match. His armored divisions would advance up to 50 miles in a single day, racing past German strongpoints, cutting communication lines, creating chaos in the rear areas. By the time German commanders realized where the main thrust was coming, Patton's forces had already moved on to the next objective. This approach required an extraordinary level of coordination and aggressive junior leadership. Patton handpicked commanders who shared his philosophy of speed and violence. He gave them broad objectives rather than detailed orders. Trust, not micromanagement. When a German defensive line showed weakness, local commanders had authority to attack immediately. No waiting for approval up the chain of command. No hesitation. See the gap, hit the gap. The result was an army that operated inside the German decision cycle. By the time Wehrmacht commanders identified a threat, coordinated a response and issued orders, the situation had already changed. Patton's forces would be miles away, attacking a different objective, while German reinforcements moved toward empty positions. Always late, always reacting, never controlling. For the soldiers facing this onslaught, the experience was about to become psychologically devastating. They weren't just losing battles, they were losing any sense of control over events. Defensive positions that should have held for days were overrun in hours. Retreat routes that seemed secure in the morning were cut by evening, and everywhere the unstoppable momentum of the Third Army grinding forward. Relentless, mechanical, inevitable. The mass surrenders of early 1945 weren't spontaneous events. They were the result of systematic destruction of German military capability that had been building for months. When tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers laid down their arms in rapid succession, it represented the final collapse of an army that had been pushed beyond its breaking point. These weren't poorly trained conscripts. They weren't reluctant foreign auxiliaries pressed into service. The German soldiers surrendering to Patton's forces came from units that weeks earlier had been considered combat effective. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived the brutal warfare against the Soviet Union, men who had faced the worst and kept fighting. Yet they chose surrender over continued resistance. That choice tells us everything about what Patton had accomplished. Several factors converged to create the conditions for mass surrender. First, the complete breakdown of German logistics. Many units were operating without adequate ammunition, fuel, or food. Soldiers can't fight without bullets. Tanks can't maneuver without gasoline. Patton's rapid advances had severed supply lines faster than the Germans could establish new ones. Second, the destruction of German communications. Many units were operating blind, no clear orders, no awareness of the larger tactical situation. Junior officers found themselves making life and death decisions without guidance from higher command. When faced with the choice between fighting to the death in an apparently hopeless situation or surrendering to preserve their men's lives, many chose surrender, the rational choice, the human choice. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the speed of Patton's advance created a pervasive sense that resistance was futile. German soldiers could see that defensive lines behind them had already been overrun. Retreat routes were cut. American forces would simply bypass and surround any position that tried to hold out. The calculation became simple. Surrender now while it's possible, or die in a battle that won't change the outcome. Thousands made that calculation, then tens of thousands, the numbers climbing every day, and each report landed on Hitler's desk like a hammer blow. Hitler's relationship with reality had always been complicated, but by early 1945, the gap between his expectations and the actual situation had become a chasm. He still believed in miracle weapons, in the possibility of political divisions among the Allies, in the fundamental superiority of German arms and tactics. The reports about Patton's advances challenged all of these delusions simultaneously. When Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's staff officers attempted to explain the situation, they struggled to find words that wouldn't trigger one of Hitler's famous rages. How could they tell the Führer that entire army groups were simply evaporating? That divisions marked on his maps no longer existed as fighting forces? That German soldiers were surrendering in such numbers that American forces were struggling to process them all? The specific day when massive surrenders peaked wasn't marked by a single dramatic moment. It was the cumulative realization that the Western Front had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent defensive line. Patton's forces weren't just winning battles. They were making traditional warfare impossible. His Third Army had captured over 140,000 German soldiers in less than 2 months. Some days saw tens of thousands surrendering as entire defensive sectors collapsed. Numbers that defied comprehension. Hitler's response, according to accounts from those present in the bunker, moved through predictable stages. First came denial. The reports were exaggerated. The soldiers were cowards. The generals were lying. Then came rage, directed at his generals for their supposed incompetence. He demanded counterattacks from divisions that no longer existed, reinforcements from armies that had already been destroyed in previous offensives. Orders screamed into phones connected to nothing. But beneath the fury was something his inner circle had rarely seen: genuine fear. Hitler understood military mathematics, even when he refused to accept their implications. The rate at which Patton was destroying German forces in the West meant that there would soon be nothing standing between the Third Army and the heart of Germany. And unlike the Soviets, who Hitler convinced himself could be negotiated with, he knew the Americans would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. For Hitler, receiving reports of these mass surrenders represented the complete collapse of everything he had built. The Wehrmacht was supposed to be ideologically motivated, trained to fight to the death for the fatherland, unbreakable. Instead, his soldiers were surrendering in numbers that exceeded the worst defeats on the Eastern Front. And they were surrendering to Patton, the American General Hitler had specifically identified as the most dangerous Allied commander. The one man he feared. The actual moments of mass surrender varied in their particulars, but followed similar patterns. American armored columns would surround a German position, cutting off all escape routes. No way out, no reinforcements coming, no hope of breakout. Rather than launching costly assaults, American commanders would often give surrounded Germans an ultimatum: simple, direct, surrender immediately, or face overwhelming artillery bombardment followed by a tank assault. Faced with this choice, most German commanders made the rational decision. The Führer's rage in the bunker, witnessed by multiple accounts from survivors, focused particularly on what he saw as betrayal by his own forces. He couldn't or wouldn't accept that his armies were simply outfought, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. In his increasingly delusional worldview, the collapse had to be explained by cowardice or treason, never by the military reality that George Patton had created. What Hitler said in those final weeks, as report after report confirmed the disintegration of German forces in the West, reveals a man confronting the consequences of his own strategic decisions. His obsession with holding every inch of ground, his refusal to allow tactical retreats, his insistence on impossible counterattacks, all of it had created the conditions for catastrophic defeat. The historical record from those present in the bunker indicates Hitler's reactions combined denial, rage, and bizarre attempts to find scapegoats. He blamed his generals for cowardice, his soldiers for lack of willpower, even the German people themselves for being unworthy of his leadership. Everyone but himself, everything but his own decisions. What he couldn't acknowledge was that he was facing a commander who had studied warfare with the same intensity Hitler had once brought to politics. A man who had created a military machine specifically designed to shatter the kind of defensive warfare Germany was attempting. Patton's achievement in this period went beyond the tactical or operational level. He had fundamentally broken the Wehrmacht's ability to function as a coherent military force in the West. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the Third Army had captured over 650,000 German soldiers, more than any other Allied army. But the real measure of Patton's impact wasn't just in numbers. It was in how he had transformed the psychology of warfare on the Western Front. The mass surrenders of March 1945 represented a watershed moment where the German military in the West essentially gave up. Not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked resources in absolute terms, but because Patton had created conditions where continued resistance seemed pointless. He had achieved what all great commanders strive for: victory not through attrition, but through the complete collapse of enemy morale and cohesion. And in Berlin, Hitler was about to face the full weight of that collapse. For Hitler, isolated in his bunker as Soviet forces closed in from the east and Patton's armies drove deep into Germany from the west, the magnitude of his miscalculation became impossible to ignore. He had dismissed the Americans as soft, their commanders as cautious, their soldiers as unmotivated, a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers, no warrior spirit, no will to fight. Patton had proven every assumption wrong, and in doing so, he had accelerated the end of the Third Reich. The 50,000 prisoners, whether taken in a single dramatic day or accumulated through relentless pressure that made such numbers routine, represented more than military defeat. They represented the complete failure of Nazi military doctrine when confronted with an enemy who fought with greater speed, better coordination, and absolute commitment to aggressive warfare. There is a bitter irony in what happened. Hitler had built his armies to conquer through blitzkrieg, lightning war, speed and shock as weapons, the formula that had crushed Poland in weeks, France in 6. That had driven the Wehrmacht to the gates of Moscow, and now he watched those same armies destroyed by an American general who had perfected lightning war beyond anything the Germans had achieved. The student had surpassed the masters. The historical record from those final weeks paints a picture of a man unraveling. The rages grew longer, the delusions deeper, the scapegoating more desperate. But beneath all of it was the inescapable truth that Hitler could never admit. He had met his match in George S. Patton, Jr., the unstoppable force he had once commanded. The Wehrmacht that had conquered a continent had been shattered by a commander who understood modern warfare better than anyone in the German High Command. The mass surrenders of early 1945 weren't just a military event. They were the death knell of Nazi Germany. The The moment when the Third Reich's fate was sealed not by attrition or overwhelming numbers, but by the complete psychological destruction of its ability to resist. Accelerated by one man, one philosophy, one refusal to fight any war except the one he knew he could win. And back in that bunker, in March 1945, when the phone call came and Adolf Hitler fell silent for 8 seconds, hand trembling, knuckles white, generals watching, he already knew. He just couldn't say it. The war was over, the Reich was finished, and the man who had broken it was still moving, still advancing, still capturing thousands more every single day. 50,000 in 24 hours, 8 seconds of silence, one man's refusal to stop.